You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is part 2 of my review of Alfie Kohn's book, Punished by Rewards. And in this week's episode, I'm going to be talking about the idea of incentive schemes in business. Alfie Kohn has a major critique of the whole idea of incentive schemes in business, and he says not only do they not work, but that they are inherently demeaning. So what to make of this claim? I think it's a very interesting topic, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this week's episode. Before we get to that, though, I just want to remind you that you can get bonus episodes of The Voluntary Life every week and many other rewards by becoming a supporter of the show on Patreon. And to find out more about that, click the link in the show notes, which you can find on your podcast player, or go to my website, thevoluntarylife.com, or directly to my Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So last week I talked about Alfie Kohn's book, Punished by Rewards, and his concept of the problem with punishment and rewards in parenting and schooling. But in his book, he also applies his theory about incentives and the problems with incentives, not just to parenting and schooling, but to work too. And his argument is that conditional incentives destroy intrinsic motivation at work. Incentive schemes don't work, and he has various studies that he puts forward as evidence against this, principally social psychology experiments by academics in universities, showing that when you provide rewards, they reduce performance on social psychology tests. So he uses a lot of these studies to show the problem with incentives, and he concludes from this that our whole approach in business to incentivizing performance is fundamentally wrong and ineffective. It just doesn't work. So this is a very interesting argument. And I mentioned last week that Alfie Kohn has a theory about why incentives don't work. But he really presents two different theories. One which he doesn't really go into much detail, which is put forward by other social scientists, and one that he favors. And just a reminder of that, the two theories about why incentives don't work are, there's one theory which is the control theory, which is that incentivization schemes feel manipulative. They feel like there's an element of an attempt to control you in them, and that is what undermines people's intrinsic motivation. When you feel like you don't have freedom and you're being controlled or manipulated by someone, that undermines your own motivation for the task that you're doing. The other theory is the idea that there is something inherently demeaning about giving someone a reward or a conditional incentive for something. And that's the theory that Alfie Kohn proposes in his book. I think he proposes that because he has a sort of socialistic outlook on life, and he's very against the market, and he doesn't really understand business or the marketplace, but he thinks that the whole idea of market interactions are somehow inherently demeaning. And I think that's why he favors that particular explanation. As I said in the previous episode, I think that there are genuine problems with incentive schemes, but it's to do with this idea of people having their intrinsic motivation being undermined when they feel that someone is trying to control them and that they're being manipulated. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this episode. My own perspective on this comes from having been an entrepreneur and having been subjected to incentive schemes in work that I've done in the past, and also tried to design incentive schemes. And I have seen how difficult incentive schemes are to get to work. So I would say it's not as if incentives are an easy thing to manage in a workplace. They are often a real pain for the people involved. They often feel stupid or badly designed or unfair. And I have personally seen how they can undermine intrinsic motivation. I know for myself, when I've worked in big organizations with incentive schemes that I have not believed to be well aligned with the kind of work that I need to do, I have found that particularly frustrating. So I'm not an advocate of incentive schemes being wonderful, easy things to do. I think they're very difficult to get right, and they're often not right. And of course, I would also agree with the general idea presented in Alfie Kohn's book that people are not simply motivated by money. I mean, I don't think any decent entrepreneur really believes that anyway, but Alfie Kohn is making the point in his book that there are other things that are far more important to people, or at least very important to people, that can be undermined if an employer just treats employees as though the only thing that matters to them is how much pay they get for what they do. And I totally agree with that. And I've done podcasts in the past about intrinsic motivation in entrepreneurship and in business. And a book that I find particularly helpful in talking about intrinsic motivation is Dan Pink's book, Drive. Dan Pink actually goes into the different kinds of intrinsic motivation. And he talks about how mastery of your work is a great intrinsic motivator, how having a sense of meaning in what you do is also really important as a motivator. And the one that I think is particularly relevant for incentive schemes in this discussion is the idea of freedom or autonomy being a very important intrinsic motivator in work. People need to feel that they have autonomy, that they have some freedom in what they're doing, and then they're not being micromanaged or controlled or manipulated. And I personally think that's the real difficulty with incentive schemes, is that sometimes they're designed in such a cack-handed way that they really make people feel like they're being manipulated at work. I will also say that I think it's particularly difficult to implement an incentive scheme that hasn't been in place in work, because when you start implementing performance-related pay, if it hasn't been there in the past, then you're changing the deal that you have with employees. And anytime anybody changes a deal, that might not necessarily be something that the other person involved in that deal agrees with. So it's very tricky to change a relationship that's already been established. And often incentive schemes are put in place because of a need, because a business is failing and so forth. And as part of that process, the entrepreneur or employer does change the deal with employees. And it may be the case that some employees never signed up to that and are not interested in working in a job with performance-related pay, for example. So there are lots of difficulties with incentive schemes, particularly with ones that are not embedded into a job from the very beginning, but become implemented later. But one thing I think is really important that this book doesn't cover very well is the question of why employers use incentive schemes in the first place. What is the point of an incentive scheme? And this is where I think Alfie Kohn really doesn't understand incentive schemes, because Kohn, in his book, thinks, and he says quite explicitly, he states that he thinks that incentive schemes are designed to make people work harder. So his basic idea is that employers use incentive schemes because they want to increase the amount of work that someone does, make them work harder. And he thinks also that employers are kind of in the grip of this ideology of behaviorism, and that the only thing that employers know how to do is offer carrots and sticks rewards to get employees to work harder. And as an alternative, Alfie Kohn says that he thinks the real problem in work is how to find a way to tap your employees' interest in doing quality work. And the reason that he's so against incentive schemes is that because he sees that when you reward a task, it seems to reduce interest in the task. He thinks that therefore, if you put in performance-related pay or other incentive schemes, what you're going to do is you're going to cause a problem and prevent yourself achieving this key task for him, which is tap your employees' interest in doing quality work. Now, the thing is, I would argue that is not the problem that an incentive scheme is trying to address. There is a bigger problem than tapping your employees' interest in doing quality work. And that bigger problem is, how on earth do you coordinate a diverse group of individuals to work towards a clear purpose of a business? And so it's not that you want to tap your employees' interest in doing quality work, or it's rather, that's not the problem that you're trying to address. The real problem is, how do you get employees working on the right thing? Because the thing is that there are many, many things that every employee could be doing. And a lot of them could be really high quality work, but they might not necessarily be what the business needs in order to succeed. And that's a real problem. It is very difficult to coordinate a diverse group of individuals to work on the right thing. And in fact, you could argue that having people work enthusiastically with great quality on the wrong thing can be even worse for a business than having people working half-assedly on the right thing. So it's a really difficult coordination problem that you face in business. How do you get people to work on the right thing? In other words, how do you get people to work on the things that need to be done? And incentivization is simply a way of providing information about what tasks or activities are most valuable to the business. That's what the purpose is to get people working on the right things, not just to get people to do some work. As an example, when I went into business, there were many things that I could have done as an entrepreneur, and I had a business partner, and we both enjoyed doing lots and lots of things, and neither of us particularly enjoyed doing sales because, frankly, sales is incredibly stressful and not that much fun, and it really pushes you to situations where you experience a lot of rejection, and it can be very demoralizing. So neither of us particularly wanted to do sales. And the problem is there were all sorts of quality things that I could do for the business, like developing marketing materials or developing software and so forth. But what the business really needed was for us to get out there selling. That was the most valuable activity that we could do. So incentive schemes provide information about what is valuable to a business, and thereby they provide a signal for, like, this is the direction that we need to go in. And Alfie Kohn seems to be aware of this coordination problem, but his response to it is, frankly, kind of pathetic in terms of his idea. He thinks that employees should be left to sort of explore their talents and come up with interesting new ideas, and he thinks that if there's a task that people don't really want to do, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing it anyway then. Maybe there are some jobs that we shouldn't be doing. So as a quote for this, he says, "The radical response to this problem is to question the necessity of making people do wretched work in the first place. It would seem that some tasks that are even more disagreeable than garbage collection simply cannot be avoided. But what interests me are the unpleasant jobs that do not have to be done in order for society to function. Those whose existence reflects the premise of our economic system, that if something sells, it has value by definition and should be produced. Should convenience foods or luxury appliances be made available if the human costs of preparing or assembling them are severe? Our answer may be yes, but the question needs to be asked. If the issue is rarely addressed, it is partly because many people are forced to choose between working at such jobs and not working at all, a choice framed not by life, but by our economic system. These people are expected to be grateful that any employment is available, regardless of the psychic and physical toll of doing such work." So what Alfie Kohn is saying here is people should be allowed to do jobs that are meaningful and fulfilling, and you shouldn't need incentivization to get people to do the jobs that are less pleasant. And he cannot envisage a way in which something like a company that creates convenience foods could have fulfilling or rewarding jobs in it. He can't imagine how it might be that you might want to work in that company if it, for example, you had various good incentives for working there. And so his response is to simply say, well, maybe we shouldn't make those kinds of things, and maybe we shouldn't have those kind of jobs. And that really is a pathetic answer to the problem of how to coordinate people within a company or within an economy, because he's talking about particularly bad jobs like garbage collection or working in a production line for convenience foods. But what about the fact that in any business, there are always things that need to get done that aren't necessarily the most interesting thing that you would like to do first? You might prefer to do quality work on something less stressful or less interesting, for example, than sales, but a company might need selling in order to survive. So that's one point that I really want to make about this critique of incentive schemes at work. Alfie Kohn doesn't really understand what incentive schemes are for. He thinks in terms of making people work harder, whereas the real issue is often how do you coordinate people? Another criticism of incentive schemes that Alfie Kohn has is that they are demeaning. And his idea here is that the basic purpose of merit pay is manipulative, which he thinks is demeaning. Now, I have to say, this is something that is a very common thing for intellectuals to find abhorrent about the market. They hate the idea that in order to make money on the market, you have to serve customers and you have to do what customers will pay more for in order to get more money, often because intellectuals think that they're incredibly valuable and ought to be paid regardless of whether or not there's demand for what it is that they do. And I have to say, I think Alfie Kohn fits into this kind of general outlook because there is nothing inherently demeaning about incentives. I mean, if I go to the supermarket and I see that there is an offer where they're providing 2 for 1 on an item, I can look at that and say, oh my God, that is so demeaning. They're trying to manipulate me into buying 2 for the price of 1. Or I can simply decide, do I really want 2 for 1 on this item? Is it worth it to me? And I can decide yes, or I can decide no. But I think it's a particularly immature attitude to argue that that in itself is demeaning. And this is the real problem with Alfie Kohn's argument against incentive schemes at work. He argues that using punishment and rewards on kids is bad, and I agree with him about that, because I think it's right to criticize treating kids as if they were consenting adults. As I said in the previous episode, the issue with conditional rewards for kids is it's not a level playing ground. There's a massive power imbalance between parents and children or teachers and children. And so it's not fair to treat kids as if they were involved in an equal-to-equal negotiation. However, that's not the case when it comes to consenting adults in a workplace environment. And this is where I think Alfie Kohn actually is kind of mistaking the adult world for a family. Employers are not parents, and employees are not children. They're involved in an equal-to-equal relationship, a voluntary relationship, and it's actually very undermining and kind of condescending to treat employees as if they were children and to imagine that employers have to be paternalistic. One quote in this book that Alfie Kohn has about incentive schemes is he says, "Incentives are demeaning since the message they really convey is, please big daddy boss and you will receive the rewards that the boss deems appropriate." And that really shows that Alfie Kohn thinks that a workplace is like a family and an employer is like a dad. My question would be, why on earth are you looking at your employer as if they're your dad? I mean, really, he needs to grow up and stop imagining that his employer is somehow a parental figure, because you're not going to have a very good negotiation if you're thinking like a child. And this is something that I think we can really take from this book and see in many other places, this problem of people mistaking society or mistaking the adult world for a family and trying to apply the same kind of rules that you would expect within a family to the adult world of work, the world of voluntary interaction. Because Alfie Kohn hasn't been very clear with himself about the moral status of parents and children and the power imbalance that is there and the involuntary nature of a family relationship, a kid doesn't get asked to be born and doesn't get asked to have you as a parent, and there's a very important power imbalance there with that. He doesn't understand the difference between that and a voluntary relationship of a workplace. You can always decide to leave your job, and as an employer, you are very aware that you could lose good employees at any time, and that would be a huge problem for you. And so it's a two-way thing, an employer-employee relationship. It's a business relationship just in the same way that you going to a supermarket and buying stuff is a business relationship. There's power on both sides. Consumers have a huge amount of power in the marketplace to put businesses out of business, and employees have a huge amount of power in work to negotiate for the things that really matter to them. And so if you're a good employee in the sense of being productive and being self-starting and motivated and so forth, you can actually have a massive impact in your negotiation about pay and other incentives. But certainly an important aspect of that is knowing that you have that power and knowing that you have that value, and not imagining that you're like a child that the employer needs to be paternalistic towards in the way that Alfie Kohn seems to imagine. All the way through the development of my business, right up until the point that I sold it and afterwards, I was always acutely aware of how easy it would be for me to lose key employees to other businesses. Because anyone who's good can find another job elsewhere. And you have the power to make yourself productive and valuable in your work. And so if you're good, your employer knows that they can lose you. If they're stupid, then they will lose you because they won't try to find ways to give you a good working environment. But if they're clever, then they're going to do everything that they can to try and keep you happy. But a part of that process is the employer is going to need you to be working on things that are really valuable. And it's just a simple aspect of information that incentive schemes show you. This is what we can reward for because this is what actually has value. It's exactly the same as when you go into a supermarket and you see that the supermarket is willing to give you more goods for less money for some things because they really want to incentivize you buying those things because that's going to work well for their business. So I think there's a really key issue here, which is determining the difference between equal to equal adult relationships in work and adult-child relationships, and Alfie Kohn doesn't really understand the difference between those two. I think that's because he's fundamentally ignorant of business. There's nothing wrong with being an academic who doesn't have any business experience or any experience of entrepreneurship. But if you want to create a grand theory of why businesses fail and make big pronouncements about what kind of activities businesses should and shouldn't do, then I think it really lacks humility to be so ignorant of how businesses really do function and to have such a kind of crude model of employers and what they do. I do think there is important evidence in some of these social psychology experiments about rewards and how they undermine intrinsic motivation. And I agree that when people feel manipulated and controlled, that does undermine their intrinsic motivation. And that's a very important consideration for designing incentive schemes, particularly because with businesses, another problem that you have is what's called the principal agent problem, which is often that it's middle managers who are designing incentive schemes, who are not necessarily working in the best interests of the entrepreneur or the business owners in creating the right environment for their business to flourish. And so there's all sorts of problems with incentive schemes. But I would just make the point that one thing that Alfie Kohn doesn't tackle at all in this book is the fact that entrepreneurship itself and the market is entirely incentive-led. It is all performance-related pay when you're an entrepreneur. There's nothing else there. That's actually the fundamental basis of entrepreneurship. You will only get paid if your business performs. And it's entrepreneurship that creates all of the incredible life-saving and life-enhancing products and services that make the modern world what it is. And it's government bureaucracies and places like the DMV, where you don't see incentives in place, where you get incredibly bad service and no innovation whatsoever. And that itself is an obvious bit of empirical evidence about the role of incentivization in business. I don't think Alfie Kohn can see that because he's got a prejudice about the market itself. And because of that prejudice, he thinks that any kind of pay for performance is somehow demeaning, which I guess means that he would not want anybody to be an entrepreneur. That's obviously a very different approach to the one that I take. And if you've been following my podcast for a while, you'll know how important I think entrepreneurship is, not only for creating a better world, but also for experiencing intrinsic motivation and for experiencing all of the great things that you can experience in terms of a sense of purpose, a sense of freedom and autonomy, and a sense of mastery, despite the fact that as an entrepreneur, your entire world is incentive-only pay, if you like. So those are some thoughts about the idea of incentive schemes and the criticisms of them in the book Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn. I'm very interested to hear what you think about that too. Let me know what you think. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.